I saw Claire through the passenger window before I understood there were three of her. One stood on the platform in the blowing snow, one was beside me in the control room screaming at me to throw the switch, and one sat behind the glass of the passing carriage with her hands folded in her lap like she was already dead. The train moved without touching the rails. I know how that sounds. I had spent 12 winters around steel, ballast, frost, and signal current. I knew what weight did to a line. I knew the groan of couplers, the shudder that climbed through timber and bolts before a freight even came into view. This thing made no vibration at all. Still, every window was full. Faces, pale, intent, patient. Men, women, children. Some in clothes, decades out of date. Some pressed so close their breath should have fogged the glass. But the windows stayed clear, as if the cold was inside with them. And in half those windows, if I forced myself to look, I saw my own face turned back at me in different ages, different haircuts, different lives. On the radio, Station 8 said, very gently, "Noah, if you let this one stop, there will be no station left to remember you." Then the signal board behind me lit green in every direction at once. I put my hand on the lever anyway. 48 hours earlier, I still believed instructions were meant to keep a man alive. I took the winter assignment because nobody else wanted it, and because men like me sometimes mistook isolation for penance. The posting described Blackwood Junction signal station as temporary seasonal coverage for a remote mountain line. Hazard bonus, storm pay, no passengers, minimal traffic, no road access during severe weather. A place where the work was repetitive and the silence was supposed to be honest. My supervisor called it a dead-end clerical winter, the sort of assignment you accepted when you needed money or wanted to be forgotten. I needed both. Years earlier, while working maintenance for the railway, I had signed off on an inspection I had not properly performed. It had been a wet spring, budget season, management pressing for speed, everybody shaving corners and telling themselves it was temporary. I told myself the same thing. By the time the derailment happened months later, my name was buried under layers of amended paperwork and legal language. The company made settlements. 3 families received condolences. A section of track was rebuilt. The internal report never used the word fault where my signature appeared, but I knew. There were deaths I had not witnessed and still remembered better than some living faces. Blackwood lay high in the northern pass where the line split, at a place marked on old maps as Switch 12. The station itself was a cluster of structures half swallowed by drifts. The main control room with its signal board and stove, the telegraph office attached by a covered walkway, an equipment shed hunched under ice, an emergency bunkhouse 20 yards off, an observation tower above the slope, and beyond them all the tracks curving into white distance like pencil lines erased and redrawn too many times. The man who delivered me by rail did not stay long enough to help unload my trunk. "Storm's sitting wrong," he said through the freight car door. "Best read the manual before dark." He handed me a ring of keys, a canvas satchel, and a typed operations booklet in a cracked plastic sleeve. Then he stepped back onto the caboose platform. Before I could ask who had worked the station before me, there had been someone. The stove was warm. The train pulled away with a sound that the snow absorbed at once. For a minute, I stood alone between the tracks and the buildings, my breath silvering in the late blue light. The mountains closed around the station like great blank shoulders. Nothing moved except the signal arms in the wind. Inside, the manual sat on the desk beneath a paperweight made from a section of polished rail. It was neat, typed, and railway official, in the way certain lies are more convincing because they wear bureaucracy like a uniform. Blackwood Junction winter operations, acting signalman instructions. The rules occupied the first page in bold. 1. Never acknowledge trains not listed on the schedule. 2. If signal 3 turns green by itself, cut power immediately and log the time. 3. Do not approach switch 12 during snowfall. 4. Ignore any radio transmission identifying itself as Station 8. 5. If the telegraph begins receiving messages in block code after 2 a.m., leave the room for exactly 7 minutes. 6. Keep the observation tower lamp extinguished after midnight. 7. If you hear a train stop outside and no arrival is scheduled, do not look out until the sound has passed. There were more. Small procedural details, each precise to the point of absurdity. How long to wait before reopening a circuit? Which stove door must remain latched? What to do if snow covered only one side of the platform? I read them twice and tried not to smile. Remote stations bred folklore the way old ships did. Men in isolation composed rituals because routine was easier than admitting fear. I had worked yards where crews would never step over a certain coupling pin, and towers where dispatchers swore particular clocks ran fast before fatalities. A blizzard could turn superstition into policy by spring. Still, I signed the last page to acknowledge receipt. The first evening was almost normal. I checked lamps, tested signal current, logged weather, inventoried coal, and unrolled my bedding in the bunkhouse. The storm thickened after dark, pressing against the windows until the glass showed only my reflection and the orange pulse of the stove. The radio hissed with static and brief weather bulletins. At 1900, a freight was due westbound through the pass. It arrived on time. I heard the steel sing, saw the beam sweep the snow, logged the passage, and felt something in myself unclench. Reality, I told myself, was still a thing with timetables. It was later, while carrying a crate of canned food from the bunkhouse back to the main room, that I noticed the loose floorboard. The board lifted easily beneath the edge of my boot in the corridor between the telegraph office and the control room. Not enough to reveal anything obvious, just enough to suggest repeated use. I set the crate down, found a screwdriver, and pried it up. Beneath it lay an oilskin packet. Inside was another rule sheet. This one was older, onion skin thin, folded and refolded until the creases had become white scars. It used the same railway letterhead, the same typeface, the same formatting, but the instructions contradicted everything I had just signed. 1. Always acknowledge unscheduled trains. They are more dangerous when ignored. 2. If signal 3 turns green by itself, leave it alone. It is warning the crossings, not you. 3. Visit switch 12 every night, snowfall or not. Count the rails before returning. 4. Station 8 is the only station still telling the truth. 5. If the telegraph begins receiving messages in block code after 2 a.m., transcribe all of it, even if the sender uses your name. 6. Keep the observation tower lamp lit until dawn. 7. If you hear a train stop outside and no arrival is scheduled, look out immediately. If you wait too long, it may think the station is empty. At the bottom, in pencil, someone had added, "The printed manual is for the other station. If you are reading this one, do not let them convince you the storm is only weather." I stood there with both sets of instructions in my hands, listening to the wind force itself through the eaves. There were practical explanations, of course. A joke from a former operator, an initiation, the sort of elaborate nonsense men left behind in isolated workplaces, so the next poor fool had something to fear besides his own mind. But both documents had real routing codes, real departmental initials, real revision numbers. And though the newer manual smelled of dry paper and office ink, the older sheet smelled faintly of ozone, wet wool, and coal smoke, as though it had spent years in a room that was no longer heated by electricity. At 2100, the radio crackled. A voice, almost buried in static, said, "Blackwood, respond. This is Station 8. I looked at both pages. Then I let the radio hiss unanswered, until the storm swallowed the voice whole. That was the first choice I made there. I spent the next several weeks discovering how many realities could hang from a single small decision. The station settled into a rhythm that would have been bearable if it had remained merely lonely. Morning began with the boiler, the signal tests, the weather log, the kettle, the sweep of snow from the walkway between the control room and the telegraph office. Blackwood demanded constant small maintenance, just to preserve the illusion of order. Frost formed around window latches. Ice climbed the inside corners of doors. Drifts erased footsteps in minutes. The signal board glowed with that patient electrical confidence designed to reassure men that somewhere beyond mountains and weather, systems were still speaking to one another. For the first 3 days, the official schedule matched reality closely enough to steady me. 2 freight movements eastbound, 1 maintenance flat car, a delayed plow. Then, on the 4th morning, I found an entry in the train ledger I had not written. 0213, Freight 91A, cleared South Junction. Signed, N. Grayson. The signature resembled mine with unsettling accuracy, except the G slanted harder than I usually allowed, and the downstroke bit deeper into the paper. At first, I assumed I had logged it half asleep, but there had been no 91A on the schedule, and the snow outside the windows lay smooth over the tracks as if no wheel had disturbed it all night. I put on my coat, lantern in hand, and walked the platform. There were no flange cuts in the snow around the points, no warmth on the railhead, no compacted powder between the ties. I knew what a train left behind, even in a blizzard. Vibration traveled. Frost broke differently. The steel held a memory of passage. These rails remembered nothing. I returned inside with numb fingers and checked the board. Along the lower branch, dim indicator lamps marked traffic on an abandoned spur line that had supposedly been closed before I was born. The name beside it, Morrow Cutoff, appeared in old timetables I had seen in museums, not in active dispatch charts. Yet the lamps winked in measured intervals like a train slowly progressing through blocks, no longer recognized by the company that employed me. At noon, a weather bulletin came through telegraph. Barrow Falls, 18/visibility, 200 yards, drift risk near tunnel mouths. I looked up Barrow Falls in the station atlas and found nothing. No town, no siding, no marker. That evening, under a layer of filing cards in the telegraph desk, I found an older regional map. Barrow Falls existed there 50 miles east on a branch retired in 1961 after flood damage. The map named 3 more settlements I had never heard of, each linked by tracks the modern system did not acknowledge. When I listened to the radio after dark, I sometimes caught station call signs that did not fit current routing patterns. Once I heard a dispatcher calmly issue a hold order to a line decommissioned after the war. Once I heard what sounded like a full passenger manifest read aloud in an accent that belonged to a different century. Formal, clipped, every surname carefully articulated, as if the dead required etiquette. On the 6th night I made my first deliberate mistake. I answered Station 8. The set hissed for nearly 10 seconds before a woman's voice emerged. It was clear enough to sound intimate, yet flattened in a way that made it impossible to guess her age. Blackwood, confirm Signal 3 status. I should have ignored her. That was the official rule. But I had begun to suspect obedience and safety were no longer related. Red, I said. A pause. Paper rustling at her end, or something imitating paper. Then you are earlier than expected, she said. Listen carefully. If you see a train on the lower curve tonight, do not use the binoculars until it passes the marker post. Who is this? Station 8. That isn't an answer. No, she said. It's the last honest station name you're likely to hear. The line died. I spent an hour angry at myself for playing along. Yet when night deepened and the valley below filled with blue stormlight, I climbed the observation tower with the binoculars hanging cold against my chest. The lower curve lay beneath switch 12, where the line vanished into a cleft between rock faces. Snow moved across the rails in sheets, thinning and thickening like breath on glass. For a long time I saw nothing. Then, near midnight, a light appeared in the storm. At first I took it for a reflection. It had the distant yellow softness of older lamps, not the harsher beam of modern locomotives. The horn followed a moment later, low and mournful, and every muscle in me tightened in recognition. A train was approaching. I could hear the wheel rhythm, the mass of it, the measured authority with which it claimed the track. I raised the binoculars by reflex. Then I remembered the warning and lowered them again. The train came on through the valley. It was real. I am careful with that word, but there is no better one. Snow swirled in its wake. Its headlamp struck the marker post. The engine emerged broad-nosed and black, its side washed in grime and silver frost. Even from that distance, I could make out the emblem on the cab. North Continental Railway. The company had dissolved 50 years earlier in a merger. Its logo, a wheel quartered by lightning bolts, survived only on collector signs and rusting depot walls. Yet there it was painted, fresh on the locomotive, as if no boardroom had ever voted it out of existence. Only when the engine had passed the marker did I raise the binoculars. The image snapped close with a sharpness that made my stomach drop. The metalwork was too clean beneath the weathering, the brass trim too deliberate. The freight cars behind the engine were not museum relics, not restored nostalgia pieces. They looked used, current, alive in some internal chronology that had nothing to do with mine. Their lettering styles shifted from decade to decade as they passed, some cars hand-painted, some stenciled in modern block marks, some bearing inspection plates from years that had not happened yet. One flat car carried crates wrapped in tarpaulins that bulged like upright bodies. A boxcar rolled by with its side door half open to reveal not cargo, but the lit interior of what looked absurdly like a waiting room. Benches, framed posters, a brass spittoon fixed to the floor. A child sat inside, dressed in a wool coat too formal for any era I understood, watching the storm as if it were scenery. Then the last car passed, and the tail lamp vanished into the cut without sound diminishing the way it should have. The valley went abruptly blank. I rushed down to the control room and checked the schedule. Nothing. I checked the track circuit logs. No occupancy. I checked the snow at dawn with shaking hands. No marks. No compressed ballast. No scored ice. The rails lay under a seamless white crust, as though the mountain itself denied what I had witnessed. Back inside, I opened the ledger. A new entry waited in my own hand. 2357, NCR, through freight acknowledged. Good Lantern Discipline, signed, N. Grayson. Below it, in smaller writing that was not mine. Next time count the cars. It matters how many versions they can hold. I began locking the doors after sunset after that, though I could not have explained what exactly I hoped a key might keep out. I met Claire on the 9th night, though according to her it was our third argument. The storm had thinned enough that the station windows reflected less and revealed more of the snowfield outside. I was in the telegraph office transcribing a burst of block code that arrived at 2:07 a.m., against the official rules and in obedience to the hidden ones, when I heard someone moving in the control room, not the scrape of settling timber, footsteps, measured, familiar enough to be alarming. I took the lantern and crossed the threshold expecting, absurdly, a supervisor or a stranded lineman. Instead, I found a woman standing over the signal board with her gloves off and both hands braced against the edge of the desk, as if steadying herself through pain. She looked about my age, perhaps a little younger. Dark hair tied back badly, parka dusted with snow, railway wool beneath it, face pale from cold, and something more exhausting than weather. She turned when the floor creaked under me, and the expression that crossed her face was not surprise. It was recognition, burdened by disappointment. "You took too long," she said. "I kept the lantern between us like a weapon." "Who are you?" "Claire Voss." She watched me closely. "Signal operator. Relief rotation. At least here I am." "Here?" She ignored that. Her gaze dropped to the sheet in my hand. "You answered the block code. Good. Last time you burned it. Last time? She blinked, and for a second her confidence slipped. Not into confusion, into calculation. How long have you been here? 9 days. No. She shook her head. How long has it felt? The question irritated me because it struck too close to something I had been refusing to examine. Nights at Blackwood did not line up cleanly in memory. I slept badly and dreamed in station noises. Sometimes I could have sworn I had already lived through a conversation before it occurred, or stood in a room that still carried the shape of furniture no longer there. I said, "You need to explain how you got in." "The tower door," she said. "You left it unlatched after checking the lower curve." "I haven't been in the tower tonight." Her mouth flattened. "Not yet." She crossed to the stove without asking permission and held her hands over it. I noticed then that the hem of her coat was wet with older snow, partly melted and refrozen in ridges. She had either come a long way or arrived from a weather pattern different from the one outside. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "Either I'm lying, or I'm confused, or the station found another way to imitate a person. You don't have to choose right now." I said nothing. She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded a page. It was another rule sheet, not the official typed booklet, not the onion skin hidden under the floorboard. This one had been written in hard pencil on the back of a maintenance form, the letters compressed and practical, as if copied in haste by someone who expected interruption. 1. Never trust train schedules after midnight. 2. If you hear footsteps in an empty room, count them. If the number changes, leave. 3. If you see yourself on a train, do not board, no matter what it says. 4. Signal 3 does not control trains. It controls crossings. 5. Do not sleep in the bunkhouse 2 nights in a row. 6. If Station 8 asks what year it is, do not answer. 7. When Noah starts remembering the derailment out loud, stop him before the train hears. I stared at the last line. She noticed. "That wasn't there the first time," she said quietly. The room felt smaller then. The stove heat too direct. "How do you know about the derailment?" "You told me." She rubbed at one temple like someone nursing a headache she had learned would become worse. "In my sequence you told me after the second disappearance. Before the archives. While we were taking inventory in a bunkhouse that doesn't exist for you yet." My sequence. Claire looked toward the window as if checking whether the dark outside had remained in place. "I think I'm ahead of you by a few hours. Sometimes a day. Sometimes I lose time instead. It depends on which line the station is touching." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the alternative required me to grant coherence to something impossible. "You expect me to believe there are lines of time crossing under the mountain? I expect you to notice that you've been trying not to believe it since you arrived." She took a breath. "Tomorrow, just before dawn, Signal 2 will fail for 19 seconds. You'll go outside and find fresh boot prints leading from the telegraph office to the tracks, but they won't be yours. At breakfast, you'll discover the tin mug on the stove says property of Barrow Falls Depot. You'll think you missed it before." Her eyes lifted to mine. "You didn't." There was no performance in her voice, no theatricality. That unsettled me more than madness would have. She sounded like a woman exhausted by repeated proof. I said, "If you've known me for months, tell me something only I would know." Claire considered that, then said, "When you signed the false maintenance report, you meant to go back and do the inspection properly the next week. You kept the work order in your jacket pocket for 6 days. After the derailment, you burned it in a sink behind the machine shed because you couldn't bear having an object in the world that still knew the order of your intentions." My throat closed. I had never told anyone that. There were details the internal review had never touched, because nobody knew they mattered. The paper had indeed stayed in my jacket almost a week. I had indeed burned it later, not out of practicality but superstition, as if ash could revise causality. "Who are you?" I asked again, and this time I meant something deeper. Claire gave a tired little smile. "That's become a harder question lately." Before I could stop her, She moved to the window and lifted the blackout curtain a few inches. "Don't," I said. Too late. Outside, on the platform under the blowing snow, a man stood facing the building. For one blind second, I thought it was a reflection. Then he tipped his head up toward us, and I saw my own face looking back through the glass. Not exactly my face. Older around the eyes, beard growth darker, a scar at the jaw I did not have, but close enough that some primitive part of me recoiled before the rest could reason. He raised one hand slowly and touched two fingers to the brim of an invisible cap in a gesture of greeting so ordinary it made the sight obscene. Claire let the curtain fall. "Now do you understand Rule 3?" she asked. I lunged for the door anyway. By the time I got outside, the platform was empty, the snow unmarked except for my own boots stamping panic into it. At dawn, Signal 2 failed for 19 seconds, and the mug by the stove read "Property of Barrow Falls Depot" in faded blue enamel letters. I would have sworn the station had not possessed the night before. After that, I stopped calling Claire delusional, though I still lacked the courage to call her right. The first disaster did not announce itself as a disaster. It began as procedure. Snow came down hard all afternoon, a dense, windless fall that erased the distance between structures until the bunkhouse looked like a memory of itself across the drifted yard. Claire spent most of the day with me in the control room, though I could never quite track where she had slept or when she had entered. Once I found a second place laid at the small kitchen table in the bunkhouse, as if I had expected her for breakfast. Another time, I discovered an extra pair of gloves drying near the stove and could not remember whether they were mine. She moved around the station with the familiarity of someone returning to a house after bad changes. She knew which floorboard clicked in the telegraph office and which cabinet stuck in the cold. At noon, she stopped me from opening the West Side supply locker. "What's in there?" I asked. "In your version," she said. "Coal, I think. In mine, teeth." I left it closed. Toward evening, the radio woke with overlapping traffic. Not static. Voices layered over each other. Dispatch calls crossing eras and distances. Fragments of clearances. Weather notices. Names of towns I had never seen, and stations that had no current designation. Underneath it all, nearly too soft to isolate, a rhythm kept repeating like a conductor punching tickets. At 1841, the signal board clicked. Signal 3 turned green. Not by route setting, not by a lever in my hand, or an occupancy circuit from a scheduled movement. It simply illuminated, a hard emerald eye in the dim board. Every muscle in me tightened. The official manual lay open on the desk. If Signal 3 turns green by itself, cut power immediately and log the time. Claire saw where I was looking and crossed the room at once. "No, it's in the manual." That manual belongs to the version trying to starve the line. She grabbed my wrist as I reached for the cutoff switch. "Leave it alone. You said it controls crossings." "It does." "Then why is it green?" "Because something is already at the crossing." Outside, the snow thickened against the windows. No train was scheduled. No circuit showed occupancy. The room felt charged, as if each metal surface had become a tongue waiting for a battery. "Claire, if you kill it now," she said, too quickly, "you'll interrupt the handoff." "Handoff to what?" She hesitated. That was enough. I pulled free and cut the power. The board died with a flat mechanical sigh. Lamps vanished. The radio ceased mid-breath. For a beat, there was only the stove ticking and the storm rubbing at the walls. Claire looked at me with a grief so immediate I thought, irrationally, that someone had died in another room. Then something moved outside. A headlamp bloomed in the snow east of the station, impossibly bright for a line I had just de-energized. The beam expanded, not advancing so much as becoming more complete, as if a train had been half present and my action had removed whatever veil made it uncertain. We ran to the platform. The passenger train came through the storm in silence. That is the detail that returns in dreams. No wheel scream, no rod clatter, no impact pulse in the rails. A full consist of lit carriages drifting forward on black steel that should have rejected them. Frost laced every window in branching white veins except for brief clearings where faces seemed to press from within. I counted 4 coaches, then 6, then 5 again. The livery kept changing. Maroon and gold, blue and cream, bare riveted metal. Logos flickering between companies that should never have shared the same route or decade. At the front, the locomotive carried no number plate at all, only a dark oval where one should have been. It approached the crossing beyond the station and vanished. No explosion, no derailment, no plunge into ravine. One instant the engine occupied space. The next it had been removed from space entirely, the coaches behind it collapsing not physically, but conceptually, each carriage thinning into snowfall like pencil lines erased while I watched. The tail lamp persisted longest, hanging in the white like a red thought, then blinked out. Claire made a sound I had never heard from another human being. Not a scream, something smaller and more hopeless, like an animal discovering a trap had closed on young it could not reach. "You did that," she whispered. I wanted to deny it, but the shape of cause and effect had already formed inside me. When dawn came, the station was wrong. The wall beside the office stove held photographs I had never seen. Staff portraits, group shots on summer platforms, award ceremonies under station signs bearing names unfamiliar and faintly false. The faces in them looked almost right, and therefore deeply unsettling, like family members rendered from an imperfect verbal description. One man I had spoken to over radio the previous week did not exist in any frame, any logbook, any directory. In his place, there were references to a supervisor named Harold Pike, whom I had no memory of, but whose annotations filled half the maintenance ledgers. Employee rosters had changed. The inventory count listed equipment from depots I knew were closed. One of the maps in the office now showed a branch line cutting directly through a mountain ridge, as if geology had once deferred to scheduling. More frightening were the absences. In the ledger, the line I had seen for the vanished passenger train was gone. So was the brief radio exchange from Station 8 I had transcribed that morning. Entire pages of entries had become blank, then resumed in a handwriting that was mine, but accompanied by incidents I did not remember surviving. At 09:10, I found my personnel file in the cabinet, though I had never placed it there. It said I had been assigned to Blackwood after a disciplinary transfer following psychological evaluation related to persistent crossing delusions following incident exposure. Attached was a witness statement, signed by Claire Voss, asserting that I had become fixated on the idea that some trains were missing people. I carried the file to Claire in the telegraph room. She looked at it once and closed her eyes. "In my version," she said quietly, "you left Signal 3 running. That's not what happened. I know that's not what you remember." She swallowed. "The train made the crossing. Hundreds of passengers. We heard them later on the radio calling from stations they should not have reached yet. Some got home, some didn't. It was messy, but it existed." She touched the altered file with 2 fingers like someone confirming a corpse. "Now all I can feel is the gap where it used to be." I said, "You're telling me I erased a train. You erased an arrival," she said. "Maybe a route. Maybe everyone who would have come from it. Maybe everyone they would have touched after." Her eyes found mine. "Do you understand why the rules contradict each other now? In one station, cutting power saves lives. In another, it unthreads them." That was the moment the problem ceased being whether I was sane. The problem became that sanity no longer described a single stable world. By evening, I could not trust the station mirrors. In one, my reflection looked sleepless and hollow-eyed as expected. In another, passing the dark window of the telegraph office, I saw myself wearing a brass-buttoned railway coat that had gone out of use decades earlier, standing beside Claire, while both of us watched a train that had not yet come. I went below the station because it was the only direction left that promised a past. Claire had mentioned archives once, in the careless tone of someone referring to an argument already settled elsewhere. "You don't find the reports until after the second switch count," she had said while sorting signal tags that changed color when I wasn't looking. Though in one run we never reached them because the tunnel door seals. By then I had learned not to ask which run. The answer was always too large and too precise. The entrance lay under the equipment shed, beneath a rack of rusted tools and snow shovels. A trap door, iron-ringed and painted over half a dozen times, opened onto stone steps breathing cold, older than the mountain weather above. I took a lantern, a pry bar, and the latest version of Claire's penciled rules. Rule 7 remained. That bothered me more each time I saw it. The tunnel beneath Blackwood had not been excavated by the current railway. The masonry belonged to an earlier confidence. Thick arched ceilings, drainage channels cut by hand, brickwork blackened by lantern smoke rather than electricity. Signal cables ran along ceramic insulators, newer than the walls, as if the modern station had been threaded through a much older throat. At the bottom I found a steel door marked restricted, subsurface survey, /authorized personnel only. The lock had been forced before. I did it again. Beyond lay a room lined with filing cabinets, map cases, and shelves bowed under ledgers. The air smelled of wet paper, machine oil, and mineral damp. A generator hummed somewhere deeper in the dark, or perhaps memory of one hummed in the concrete. My lantern threw long shadows across stacked crates, labeled with years spanning almost a century. The archives were not about freight schedules or maintenance budgets. They were about sightings. Duplicate consists reported on separate branches at the same hour. Passenger manifests, matching travelers who had died years earlier or not yet been born. Engineers describing sightings that appeared in fog, where no surveys had ever placed track. Whole trains observed entering tunnels too short to contain them, and never emerging, only to be reported crossing stations hundreds of miles away minutes later. A laborer's report from 1908 described a second dawn beneath the mountain, accompanied by the passing of a line with no sparks, no smoke, and windows lit in a blue, not known to lamps. The earliest documents called it a geological disturbance, then a magnetic anomaly, then a refraction event. By the 1930s, the language had become colder and more careful. Convergence, overlap, recurrence, parallel occupancy. Switch 12 appeared in nearly every file. The junction had been built not where traffic flow was best, but where incidents were densest. The mountain pass beneath it sat over a seam of impossible behavior first noticed, when surveyors found rails left overnight, had shifted alignment without labor, matching measurements from an abandoned line 40 miles away. During wartime, military trains reported passing civilian services on tracks officially reserved and blockaded. In 1954, a sleeping car arrived at Barrow Falls, carrying passengers whose tickets were stamped for towns destroyed by flood 7 years before. A confidential memorandum from 1972 summarized the station's true purpose. Blackwood Junction functions as an observation and mitigation site for recurrent railway overlap phenomena. Transportation continuity is secondary to reality stability within the pass. Local operators are to follow approved containment instructions without need to know background. Containment. There were appendices of rules revised and revised again. Entire pages cross-referenced with casualty totals and phrases like successful in sequence C or catastrophic under Morrow conditions. Some instructions matched my official manual. Others matched the hidden sheet. Others matched Claire's penciled notes almost word for word. Different departments, different dates, different stationery, not different mistakes, different stations. I spread 3 binders across a table and began building the only theory that fit the evidence without softening it into metaphor. Blackwood was not haunted in the simple sense. It was a junction in more than railway geometry. At this place, under stress, weather, electrical load, traffic density, maybe nothing more than time itself, multiple versions of the rail network intersected, not symbolically, literally enough to exchange paperwork, radio traffic, rolling stock, and people. Each reality had learned its own survival habits. Each had encoded them as rules. Each believed its procedures universal because, within its own sequence, they were. Then the boundaries weakened. Instructions bled across. A warning that saved passengers in one version erased them in another. That was the structure I could finally see, and seeing it did not comfort me. It made every choice heavier. I found another file labeled Incident, Red Cedar Derailment, /closed review access, and nearly left it untouched. I opened it anyway. It was not my derailment, at least not exactly. Same date, same region, same curve number, but the casualty figures differed. In one attached clipping, nobody died. In another, 43 did. One report named a supervisor I had never worked under. One witness summary used my signature on a maintenance authorization in a handwriting subtly more disciplined than mine. A note paper-clipped to the file bore a single typed sentence. Subject Grayson. Shows recurrent sensitivity following guilt-linked branching event. Recommend transfer to Blackwood if overlap intensifies. I sat down very slowly. The mountain room seemed to tilt, not physically but narratively, as if I had just discovered I was not only trapped in the problem, but had been selected for it by versions of people who knew me better than my own company did. The guilt I carried might not have been incidental. It might have made me porous. A man who had built his identity around a single catastrophic choice was perhaps easier for multiple realities to claim. Each version of me was already organized around the same wound with different outcomes. That thought followed me deeper into the archive where I found hand-drawn route diagrams connecting stations that shared names but not histories. Blackwood, Station 8, Barrow Falls, Morrow, St. Aldan, North Spur, Ash Crossing, nodes on a lattice that did not belong to one map. Notes in the margins described awareness emerging in later incidents. Not passenger awareness, train awareness. At first, the reports were almost embarrassed by the implication. Signals changing in advance of operator intent. Unscheduled arrivals, matching future emergency reroutes before those reroutes were ordered. Conductors who appeared to recognize observers across sequences. A 1988 report, heavily redacted, included the line, "The consistus demonstrated preference for unresolved identities," and attempted repeated conversational contact through available station media. Something scraped behind me. I turned too fast, lantern swinging. Nothing stood in the aisle between the cabinets. Yet one drawer had slid open by itself. Inside lay photographs, loosely bundled in twine. I lifted the top one. It showed the platform at Blackwood in winter. The station clock read 0314. A passenger train waited beside the snowbound platform with every carriage lit. In the nearest window, a man sat alone. He was me. And not a resemblance. Me. Different coat, older around the mouth, but undeniably me, staring out toward whoever held the camera with the exhausted resignation of someone already used to being found in impossible places. Written on the back, sequence uncertain. Passenger accepted boarding after prolonged refusal. Results pending. I put the photograph down and understood, with perfect clarity, that the archives were not only recording the overlap, they were feeding it with observation. Every report was a way of teaching the phenomenon what humans noticed. Every rule was an experiment, and somewhere between the rails and the storm, something had started learning back. After the archives, the station no longer pretended to be singular. It shifted in open sight. The bunkhouse was the first place I watched it happen knowingly. At dusk, it contained my trunk, 2 blankets, a chipped wash basin, and the enamel mug from Barrow Falls. I crossed to the control room for less than 10 minutes, arguing with Claire over whether we should cut the telegraph line after sundown. When I returned, the bunkhouse had 3 bunks instead of 2. The wash basin was gone. On the far wall hung a framed safety poster warning no open flame near cylinder lamp feed. Though our station did not use gas lamps in any version I recognized, someone had carved initials into the window frame. CV/NG, don't sleep at the same time. The carving looked old. I touched it and felt fresh splinters. The telegraph office changed more subtly but more often. Some nights the desk held a compact relay unit stamped with a manufacturing year 10 years in the future. Other nights the sounder itself became an earlier brass assembly with ornamental screws and cloth-wrapped wiring, beautiful and inconvenient as a relic. Once I found a stack of blank message forms bearing a royal crest from a railway charter that had never existed in my country. Claire was unsurprised. She had begun sorting the station not by room but by condition. "This is a 19-hour office tonight," she said, glancing at the sounder. "Don't trust anything written after midnight." "How can you tell?" She gave me a look. "You start by surviving enough versions to notice the smell changes." She was deteriorating, though I could not prove deterioration in any ordinary medical sense. Sometimes she spoke to me as if a conversation had already happened. Sometimes she forgot details she had earlier insisted were fixed. Twice I saw her at a distance moving between buildings, while another Claire sat across from me in the control room with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. The first time I mentioned it, she went still. "How many?" she asked. "2. "That's bad," she said. "If you see 3, don't let any of us out of your sight." "What does that mean?" "It means the station can't decide whether I'm an operator, a witness, or cargo." I hated how calmly she said things that should have broken language. The blizzard intensified until the world beyond the platform ceased to behave like space. Snow did not merely fall. It arranged itself into moving curtains that briefly suggested walls, carriage interiors, rows of waiting passengers, long parallel lines receding where no track had ever been laid. At night, the horn of distant trains sounded from impossible bearings, above us on the ridge, below us under the foundations, once directly behind me while I stood against a locked door. I spread the rule sheets on the control room desk, like competing scriptures. Official manual, hidden floorboard instructions, Claire's penciled list, archive appendices copied from older sequences. I began marking overlaps, contradictions, and conditions. A rule that failed in active snowfall, succeeded in freezing mist. A ban on acknowledging unscheduled trains appeared in documents linked to high passenger casualty sequences, while acknowledgement correlated with lower disappearance rates but increased personnel contamination. Signal 3 behaved differently, depending on whether the crossing itself belonged to our line or an overlapping one. I found no universal truth, only local survivals. Claire watched me work for a long time before saying, "That's what Blackwood really does to people. It turns morality into calibration." I looked up. "If I choose the wrong rule," I said, "people vanish. If you choose the right one, different people vanish somewhere else." The stove popped softly. Wind pressed against the walls. Her face, in that orange light, looked older than the rest of her, as if fatigue came from accumulated versions rather than sleeplessness. "Then how have you been deciding?" I asked. "I stopped trying to save everyone." She said it without pride. "I save whichever sequence I'm standing in until it stops being a place a human mind can live." That answer repulsed me because I understood it. I asked the question I had been avoiding. "Are you from here?" Claire smiled sadly. "Which here?" "This station, this reality, the one I came to." "I think I was." She paused. "Then I think I wasn't. Then sometimes I remember being the first one to find you on the platform. And sometimes I remember being the one who waited for you on the train." "On the train?" She nodded toward the dark window. "There are versions where you boarded. That night, Station 8 returned on the radio with unusual strength. Not static thin, but close, almost room clear. "Blackwood," said the same woman's voice. "Overlap threshold rising. Non-selection will result in forced convergence." "What does that mean?" I asked. Claire mouthed, "Don't tell it anything." The radio answered before I spoke again. "It means one reality will dominate," Station 8 said. "The rest will be rendered into schedule memory." I glanced at the rules spread before me. How do I choose? By deciding what your crossing can tolerate. That's not an answer. "No," she said. "It's the only one you have time for." Claire snatched the handset from me. "Who are you really?" A long pause followed. Then the voice said, not unkindly, "I'm what your station called us after ours was taken." The line cut. For an hour afterward, the station groaned around us with sounds of shifting weight, not structural strain, reassignment. A hallway seemed longer than it had been at dusk. The observation tower stairs counted 13 risers on one climb and 16 on the next. Switch 12 appeared through the tower glass to split into 3 separate junctions for the span of a blink, one buried in snow, one muddy in spring rain, one lit by a summer dusk full of insects. I understood then that refusing to choose was itself a choice, and a dangerous one. If the realities were going to separate again, it would not happen through obedience. The rules were not laws of nature. They were leverage points, improvised splints on fractures moving under pressure. To select one completely would be to let that version of Blackwood anchor the rest, and every version, I now suspected, carried its own debt. Mine was just the one I remembered. Before dawn, Claire took me to Switch 12, despite every warning I had ever received about it. Snow drove against us, hard enough to erase the station behind. At the junction, we stopped where 3 rails should have become 2. There were 4. No, 5. Then 4 again. Separate lines occupying nearly the same space, their steel edges shimmering under snow like stacked reflections. "Count them," Claire said. I did. When I reached the last, I realized one of the rails was warm. Beneath my glove, it pulsed faintly like a vein. "That's the line that wins if you obey," Claire said. "And if I don't?" She looked back toward the station, where a green signal flickered behind the storm. "Then maybe," she said. "For once the station has to survive us instead." Once I understood the trains were not merely vehicles, every earlier incident rearranged itself around that fact. The overlap had begun as geography, perhaps, or physics beyond our language, but the thing moving through it had become purposeful. It used railways because railways already taught humans to accept inevitability. Routes, arrivals, departures, timetables, compartments, categories of who belonged where and when. What better shape for an intelligence that wanted to sort realities into consumable order? It stopped pretending after that. Schedules rewrote themselves while I watched, not just new entries appearing, but entire chains of destinations, correcting an elegant clerkly script across the board. Freight became mixed service. Local became express. Towns absent from one version of the map inserted themselves into another, as if paper had remembered obligations ink once made. At 2103, the board listed a service called the Through Passage, with no origin and no terminating station. At 2104, the entry was gone. At 2110, I found it penciled into my own notebook in handwriting I had not used since school. The next train that passed came close enough for me to see the passengers clearly. It moved on the northern line under a sky flashing with dry lightning inside the blizzard. Every carriage was occupied. People sat too still, not sleeping, but waiting. Some looked injured, some old-fashioned, some perfectly ordinary, except for the way they watched the station with an expectation I could feel from the platform. Their windows were clear this time, and each face seemed lit by a source not entirely inside the train, halfway down the consist. I saw a man with my father's mouth and my own eyes. In the next carriage, a boy of about 10 stared out with my exact expression from school photographs. Then a gray-haired version of me, cheeks hollowed with age, lifted 2 fingers against the glass in the same calm greeting the platform figure had used days earlier. Claire dragged me back under the awning before I could step closer. "It wants recognition," she said. "How many are there?" She did not ask what I meant. "Enough to make you think counting helps." The radio became bolder. Conductors' voices entered dead channels to request platform confirmation. Dispatchers from impossible routes asked whether Blackwood was accepting transfer stock tonight. Once, in the middle of my own spoken sentence, another voice used my mouth through the handset to answer, "Yes, as many as you can send." I dropped the microphone like a hot wire. Station 8 called during the small hours. This time the voice identified herself as Mara, then said she doubted that name had belonged to her in every line. She spoke with the composure of someone who had run out of fear before losing hope. "The trains are no longer carrying passengers," she said. "Not in the sense you mean." "What are they carrying?" "Possibilities," she said. "Resolved lives. Unlived branches. People as roots. Every reality they absorb becomes another carriage they can schedule." The phrase should have sounded abstract. Instead, it landed with physical disgust. I pictured the endless train as an administrative hunger, building itself from choices reduced to inventory. "Why us?" I asked. "Why railways?" "Because railways already cross borders while insisting they're the same line." "Why you?" "Because guilt leaves tracks. The phenomenon follows what forks cleanly." Claire listened from the desk, face turned away, though I knew she heard every word. Mara continued. "Blackwood used to monitor the overlap. Then it began standardizing it. Every rule you wrote down, every exception you logged, every successful survival, those became data. The trains adapted. Human containment educated the crossing. The archive photographs returned to me then. All that careful watching, all that filing and labeling. We had taught the thing how we chose." "And Station 8? I asked. "What happened to it?" Another pause. When Mara answered, her voice thinned around the edges. "We kept acknowledging the wrong trains because it reduced disappearances in the short term. They stopped taking our people from the platform. Instead, they took our alternatives. After a while, nobody could remember which losses were missing and which were simply unselected. That made us easy to board." The line crackled with sounds like distant ticket punches. Claire leaned close and spoke into the receiver before I could stop her. "Are you on a train now?" Mara answered immediately. "I'm in the station that remains of one." Then the transmission dissolved into overlapping announcements in multiple voices, all courteous, all inviting. After that, the trains began anticipating us. I would reach for a signal lever and find the route already set to match the choice I had only considered. Claire would say, "Don't go to the tower," and a horn would sound from directly below the tower foundation, as if acknowledging the command. The telegraph received messages referencing conversations we had not yet had, including one chillingly practical line, "Your contradictions have been noted." Further improvisation will be timetabled. On the 3rd night of this escalation, a conductor stepped down. The train rolled to a halt outside despite no signal clearance and no track vibration. Carriages stretching beyond the storm, in both directions farther than the valley could physically hold. Doors opened in sequence, warm yellow rectangles cut into the white. Nobody else emerged, only the conductor. He wore a black uniform that borrowed details from a dozen eras: brass buttons, modern rank tabs, old leather gloves, a cap badge that shifted when I tried to focus on it. He was smiling in the professional, mild way of a man approaching a platform inquiry desk. "Mr. Grayson," he called over the snow, "you've been difficult to classify." Claire stood behind me in the doorway, holding an iron signal spike like a knife. I said nothing. The conductor glanced past me into the station, as if admiring improvements. Blackwood has always produced such conscientious operators. You record so well. You distinguish so carefully. It makes collections smoother. What are you? Claire asked. He considered her. A timetable with appetite, perhaps. A route that discovered recurrence. Must we be poetic about it? His politeness was worse than a threat. You can't have this station, I said. The conductor's smile widened almost imperceptibly. My dear fellow, I don't require the station. I only require your preference. The rest of the rails align around it. He lifted a small punch ticket between gloved fingers. On it was printed my name several times in different typefaces. You've already traveled with us under other conditions, he said. Some of you were quite relieved. Then he looked directly at Claire. And some of you were baggage. She flinched as if struck. The conductor noticed with what seemed like genuine satisfaction. I slammed the door. When I opened it seconds later, with the spike in hand, the train had not moved, but the conductor was gone. On the threshold lay the punch ticket, damp with snow. On its reverse, in tiny, precise lettering, were the words, "Final boarding occurs when rules converge." That was when I stopped thinking of survival as obedience and started thinking of it as sabotage. Whatever intelligence used the trains had become strongest, where our behavior was predictable. Rules fed it because rules narrowed futures. Every compliance erased alternatives until the train could collect what remained. To keep any reality from being fully scheduled, I would have to become unschedulable. And for the first time since Red Cedar, the thought did not feel like punishment. It felt like work. By the end, Blackwood Junction was less a station than a knot in the act of becoming. Signals lit without circuits. Doors opened into the wrong rooms. Snow fell upward beyond the platform, while ash drifted down inside the telegraph office, though nothing burned. Once I crossed from the control room to the bunkhouse and stepped into a summer platform crowded with travelers in linen coats, before the scene tore sideways and returned me to winter so hard I lost balance. Claire existed in multiplication now, not always visibly, which would have been easier. Sometimes I only felt the pressure of her other presences. Someone moving in the tower, while the Claire beside me gripped the desk. Someone breathing just beyond a half-open bunkhouse door. Someone whispering, "Not this one," from the telegraph office when I was alone. Twice I saw two Claires at once. One bloodied at the mouth, one untouched. They looked at each other with a resentment more intimate than fear. "If there are three," the unharmed one said, "don't listen to the one who cries." The wounded one answered, "That's exactly what she said before you killed the spring line." I no longer knew which of them had shared my history, or whether that mattered. The trains circled closer. Their horns came in patterns now, call and response across impossible distances. Schedules rewrote themselves into dense columns of arrivals, headed for destinations that sounded less like places than conditions. Retained sequence, compartment of witnesses, south of the choice. The board listed platforms we did not possess, and departures from lines that existed only under the mountain. I watched enough to recognize the entity's assumption. It believed human beings could only resist by choosing a rule set and holding it. Order against order, method against method. It had learned our habits from a century of operators, clerks, engineers, supervisors, all trying to fence the impossible with procedure. Even rebellion, under those terms, became legible. So I decided to give it illegibility. "Help me make a collision," I told Claire. Which Claire I said it to, I cannot be certain. In the archive I had copied the contradictory trigger conditions from as many sequences as I could find. Signal 3, on and off. Acknowledge and ignore. Tower lamp lit and dark. Switch 12, counted and uncounted. Telegraph engaged and abandoned. Crossing circuits open in one line, grounded in another. Under ordinary thinking, these were fatal combinations. That was the point. If the trains were strongest where possibilities collapsed into one scheduled path, Then I needed to widen the fracture until no single line could claim precedence, not choose a reality. Jam several together so violently the convergence could not hold shape. It was a terrible plan. It was also the first one that belonged entirely to me. We started with the signals. I re-energized sections the manual forbade and cut others the hidden sheet demanded stay active. Claire, one or more of her, ran between relay cabinets with a lantern and a coil of wire, bridging circuits that had never been designed to speak. I opened the tower lamp shutters while extinguishing every platform light. I answered Station 8, and then left the handset off the hook transmitting wind. I stamped acknowledgement into the ledger for trains not present, and refused clearance to ones already arriving. The control room fought us. Indicator lamps burst. The board hummed with a low animal sound. Once, when I threw a lever for a non-existent southern turnout, every window in the station flashed from night to afternoon, and back again so quickly my eyes watered. Outside, the rails at switch 12 multiplied. 3, 5, 7, crossing and recrossing under the snow like fish bones under skin. Some rose above the ballast unsupported, others dove into the mountain wall without opening. Train lights appeared on all of them at once. Claire shouted from the tower, "It's reading you, faster." The first locomotive arrived from the east wearing North Continental colors. The second came from the north under a company name I had only seen in the archives. The third emerged silently from the cut, where no active line should have fit beside the others. Every window crowded with those patient passengers who might have been living people or unresolved selves. I routed all three toward one another. Any railroad man will tell you that track logic is conservative by nature. It resists contradiction because contradiction kills. But Blackwood had ceased being a railroad problem. Under the layered realities, steel no longer obeyed singular geometry. The points answered multiple commands. Routes occupied each other. A green aspect shone over a dead line while a red held against an empty one. I threw every lever I could reach, until the board glared like a fever chart. The trains did not collide in the ordinary sense. They interpenetrated. That is the only word that comes close. Their fronts entered the same crossing from incompatible angles, and instead of impact there was a shearing bloom in the air, like paper being torn in a room larger than the world. Windows overlapped windows. Passenger faces stacked, separated, recombined. For a moment I saw hundreds of Noahs at once, not metaphorically, but distinct, terrified, resigned, furious, old, young, uniformed, injured, some standing on platforms I did not know, some already seated in carriages with punched tickets in hand, and among them Claire. Again and again, operator and passenger, and corpse and witness. The conductor stood at the center of the impossible crossing, unharmed, smiling no longer. "You mistake disruption for escape," he said, though I could not tell whether he spoke aloud or through every station speaker at once. I answered by cutting power to signal 3 and forcing it green manually, with a jumper wire copied from an old maintenance diagram. At the same time, one Claire lit the tower lamp, and another smashed it. I acknowledged the unscheduled service over radio while refusing it in the ledger. I counted the rails at switch 12 aloud and deliberately lost my place. Contradiction spread through the station like fire taking dry walls. The mountain answered. A deep concussion rolled under the foundations, not explosion, but separation. The various rooms of Blackwood peeled away from one another in brief exposures. For an instant I stood in the control room of a gaslit 1890s signal box. Then, in a future relay office lit by panels I could not name. Then, in a charred shell open to the weather. The telegraph sounder rattled in every era at once, sending nonsense and prayer. The trains began to come apart. Cars detached not from couplings but from continuity. One slipped backward into the storm and became only headlamps. Another folded into a line I could see under the mountain through solid rock. Faces at the windows changed too fast to follow. Some passengers pounded the glass. Some turned away in relief. Some versions of me among them simply watched as if they had expected this reckoning for years. I saw the conductor last. He tipped his cap with that maddening civility and stepped backward through a carriage door that opened onto darkness wider than rail gauge, wider than tunnel, wider than any route men should have built. Then the door closed, and the carriage dissolved into whirling snow. The silence afterward had weight, no horn, no relay chatter, no overlapping voices. Even the wind seemed temporarily unwilling to enter. I found myself on my knees in the control room with melted frost soaking my gloves. The board was dead. Half the windows were cracked. The stove had gone out. Somewhere nearby, Claire was laughing or sobbing, and I could not tell which, until I realized it was me. When dawn finally reached Blackwood, the station stood alone on the mountain again. One set of tracks, one signal mast visible through settling snow, one ruined night that no schedule would ever fully account for. I had not saved everyone. I knew that with the same certainty I knew my own name, but for the first time, the trains had not gotten to decide which loss counted. Spring came as if winter had been embarrassed by what it had witnessed. The road crews reopened the pass in stages. Snowbanks receded from the platform edge. Gravel and black ties emerged from drifts like bones from thawing earth. Meltwater ran under the station in clear, relentless threads. Men from district operations arrived with clipboards, replacement parts, and the practical impatience of people who wanted damage to be measurable. Their version of events was boring. A severe storm, prolonged isolation, signal failures due to ice and old wiring, possible sleep deprivation, structural issues in the telegraph annex. Recommendation: decommission Blackwood Junction due to maintenance costs and line consolidation. No one argued when I resigned. No one asked many questions when I told them records had gone missing. Files were already incomplete by then. Ledgers that had once held impossible entries contained only water damage and ordinary train movements. The archive room under the equipment shed was sealed in the final survey due to foundation instability. When I forced the issue, 3 men insisted no sub-level storage had ever existed beneath that building. I walked them to the trap door and found only a concrete floor. Claire was nowhere in any of it. There was no personnel file for Claire Voss in district records. No relief operator by that name had been assigned to Blackwood. No payroll trace, no emergency contact, no locker contents. The carving in the bunkhouse frame had vanished with the replacement sash. When I described her to a superintendent who had reviewed all seasonal staffing logs, he looked at me with the careful courtesy reserved for men recovering from weather and strain. I almost accepted that. Not that she had been imaginary, never that. But that imagination might be the only category left capable of holding her. Then the photograph arrived. It came months later to my apartment in the city, in a plain cream envelope, with no return address and no postmark I recognized. Inside was a folded timetable, printed on thick, old-fashioned stock, the sort collectors pay too much for at estate sales. The heading bore no railway company name, only a route designation. Blackwood through service. There was one listing. Arrival, 11:43 p.m. Platform, unassigned destination. The version you left behind. My hands had begun shaking before I reached the second enclosure. The photograph was glossy, recent, and taken from inside a passenger carriage. Claire sat beside the window in a dark coat, older by years than the woman I had last seen at Blackwood, though not in any simple linear way. Her hair was streaked at the temples. There were lines beside her eyes, I recognized from mirrors after sleepless weeks. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression I spent a long time trying and failing to name. Not fear, not accusation. Recognition, perhaps, but tempered by pity. Behind her, the carriage extended deeper than perspective allowed, row after row of passengers lit by soft compartment lamps. At first, they were only a crowd. Then, I began seeing the faces. Mine. Hundreds of them. Different ages, different clothes, different injuries, different little histories visible in the set of a mouth or the confidence of posture. A teenager with blood on his collar. A heavy-set, middle-aged man in a wedding ring I had never worn. An elderly version of me asleep against the glass. A child holding a ticket in both hands. Some met the camera head-on. Others studied Claire. A few seemed to be arguing with versions of themselves just outside the frame. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting I knew to be Claire's, before I had fully admitted I knew it, were the words, "You saved your reality." Beneath that, in a different hand, precise, neat, almost clerical, appeared a second line. The train still needed passengers. I sat at my kitchen table until dark, gathered in the window over the sink, and turned my apartment into a dull reflection around the paper. The city outside went on with its vast, ordinary indifference. Sirens, buses, neighbors, steam rising from rooftop vents. Somewhere a train horn sounded from the freight corridor near the river, and every nerve in me tightened before reason reminded me it belonged to the world I knew, or mostly knew. I took the timetable to the railway archives downtown the next day. No printer's mark, no catalog match. The paper stock contained fibers from a mill that had closed in the 1980s. The ink was modern on one side, older on the other. The clerk who examined it asked where I had found such a convincing novelty piece. I lied and said an estate auction. For a week after that, I slept with the lights on. Then, I stopped sleeping much at all. I began hearing patterns in ordinary transit announcements. Not words at first. Cadence. The warm, false patience of platform instructions. Once, standing underground waiting for a commuter line, I looked up and saw my own face, reflected in the opposite tunnel glass, where no train had yet entered. The reflection lifted 2 fingers to an invisible cap. By the time I turned, the tunnel was empty. I never went back to the mountains. That should matter. In some moral accounting, refusal should count for something. But Blackwood taught me that roots do not depend entirely on consent. They depend on recognition, repetition, and the hidden appetite of systems that learn from human attempts to survive them. Sometimes I take out the photograph and try to identify which version of me looks happiest, or most trapped, or closest to remembering the life I call mine. Sometimes I focus on Claire and wonder whether she sent the warning or the invitation. Sometimes I think the second note was kinder than the first, because at least it told the truth plainly. You can save a world and still feed the line. The timetable's date is next month. I have not decided whether I will be where it says the train arrives. That is the part of the story I still own, unless ownership itself is another clerical illusion the railway allows us while it stamps our passages in duplicate. Last night, just after midnight, I heard a locomotive horn from beyond the city limits. There are no active tracks in that direction anymore. They were torn up years ago. The sound came again, faint, patient, and impossibly far below hearing, like something moving through weather on a route older than maps. I put the photograph face down on the table. A minute later, when I looked back, Claire was no longer watching the camera. She was looking at me.